Hi, welcome back to another Serger tip clip. Today I'd like to show you one of my favorite decorative stitches on a serger, and that's a reverse flatlock, or it's sometimes called a ladder stitch. Now this stitch is the flip side of the flatlock stitch, and you might have seen that in a previous tip clip, but I'm going to show you a little bit of not only how to do the stitch, but another really cool technique to use along with it. And I think it'll make your future projects pop if you decide to use it. It's so pretty. I love it. I get very excited even talking about it. But before we go to the machine or start talking any more about the stitch, I want to remind you to please subscribe to my YouTube channel, and you'll receive a notification when I post a new tip clip. And also, if you have any suggestions or questions, send them along and I'll get back to you as quickly as possible. So let's take a look at this stitch. I use this on my Serger tote bag pattern, and I've done one half of one of the center panels already. But what I've done with this is I've woven 2 1/8-inch ribbons through the ladder stitch, and it's kind of like a basket weave technique, and I'll show you how to do that at the end of this. But I'm going to set up my machine for a 2-thread reverse flatlock. So let me give you the setup for that. I'm going to put an 80-12 or 90-14 top stitch needle in the left overlock needle position, and I'm going to use my upper looper converter to close the eye on the upper looper because we're not putting any thread in the upper looper. And I'm going to put a coordinating color Serger cone thread in my lower looper. The stitch length can vary. That depends strictly on how close you want those stitches to be. There's no right or wrong on that. And on this one, because I'm using it on a stable woven fabric, even though I'm not on a stable grain line, I tested it and I'm leaving my differential feed setting on the default setting 1 or N. So I think we're all set up at the machine. I also want to mention that it's the needle thread that creates the ladders. And the reason I have a top stitch needle in is because I'm using a 12-weight decorative thread in my needle. A standard or ELX 705 needle would have too small an eye in it for the 12-weight thread. So that's why I do have the top stitch needle in. One other thing I wanted to mention is that not only is this a beautiful decorative stitch, but it can be used as a construction stitch as well. Now, my one thing that I would say is that if you're doing this on garment sewing, I would use either a 3-thread flatlock or reverse flatlock stitch on that rather than a 2-thread, unless it's a seam that won't get any stress. Like if you're using it as a hem stitch or on a loosely fitting garment, that's fine. But again, I would opt for a 3-thread flatlock as opposed to a 2-thread on anything that's going to get any kind of stress. And also, if I were doing this, I would not do it on anything that's a super high stress type of seam because it is not quite as strong as, say, a 4-thread overlock stitch. So that's just a little suggestion from me. Let's go to the machine and see this in action. I have my needle tension set at 1 and my lower looper tension set at 9. For the ladders to pull flat, you want very little tension on that needle thread because those are the ones that create the ladders. And you'll see what I'm talking about when we go to open up the fabric and show the stitching. My stitch length is just a little shorter than 2.5. I'd say it's about 2.2. Let's take a look at the inside of the machine to take a look at that upper looper converter and how that works. I've opened up the machine so that you can see the upper looper converter. and it's all part of the upper looper. It's all attached. So it's very easy to flip over and engage it. And the eye of the upper looper is right here, right on the tip of the looper. And so what I want to do is close that eye because I'm not putting thread in it. So we're going to flip the converter over, and there's a tiny little prong on the end of it. So what I want to do is just gently push it back, and I can feel it clip right into that eye and close it. So now we're all set up to go. I have my lower looper threaded with the air threading and the top stitch needle in the left overlock position. If you wanted to do a narrower reverse flatlock, you could switch that needle position over to the right needle and it would skinny it down just a little bit. I've drawn lines that are 2.5 inches apart, and they're at a 45-degree angle to the length of the fabric. And you might notice these little marks that go across it, and we'll do a close-up of that to show you. I always like to start on the same side of the fabric, the same edge. And sometimes if I get interrupted or I stop stitching for any particular reason and I can't tell which side I started on or which edge I started on. So I am going to get started, and I'll start right down here on my starting line. I'm folding my fabric right sides together along that line. I'm not going to press it with the iron. I'm just going to fold it gently because I don't want a crease in the fabric. And there is a knee lift on this machine, but in order to get the tripod in nice and close, I didn't attach it. So, but I'm going to bring that, and I'm going to let the knife skim off a scant 1/8 inch as I stitch along. So I'm going to put my presser foot down. So let's give this a go. And as I'm stitching, it doesn't look like much of anything at all. And the tension kind of looks funky on it, and it should, because you'll see why in just a minute. Just skimming off, and I actually forgot to put on my little waste bin. Let me just pop that in to grab the scraps. There we go. Okay. Okay, here's the first row, and I'm gonna show that to you. And it does look kind of funky. It looks sort of loose, and this is my lower looper thread. If I flip it over, you'll see the thicker decorative thread. That's my needle thread. Now, this is the fun part, and I love showing this to people. I'm just gonna trim off this little thread tail at the beginning. Pop that right into the waistband. So let's open this stitch up. I love this. And all you have to do is you're going to pull on the stitching as you go along, and the ladders, which is the needle thread, magically appear. Now, one thing I will tell you is that you always want to cut your fabric longer and wider, and particularly wider in this instance than you're going to need for your finished dimensions, because the flatlock stitching kind of eats up a little bit of the fabric as you go along. All right, we've got our stitching done, and I'm going to show you this on one that I've already trimmed off and gotten ready for the weaving. But before I do that, I want to show you my little trick for getting the fabric to lay flat completely, both layers to lay flat, I should say, under the ladders. So I pull this flat, and I think all of my ladders look pretty even. And this top layer, this is a darker fabric. It's a little bit hard to see. This top fabric is folded a little bit. So I take a long upholstery needle, but you can use almost anything you want underneath here, just not anything too thick. And what I like to do is get it under this little fold, and I just kind of pull it to flatten it out a little bit, just like this. And that completely flattens it out. And then before I do my weaving, I like to give this a nice press from the front and the back. And it's good to put a press cloth over it just to protect the fabric and your thread. So that's all set to go. Let's take a look at one that I've already finished up. I think I'll go over 3 and under 3 ladders. So I'm starting under, coming over, under, over, under. And I'm just going to go along the length of this and pull my ribbon through. And if you accidentally go through the wrong number, you can always pull it right back out and start over from where you made the mistake. And trust me, I've done that lots of times. In fact, I did it last night. So no big deal on that. Whoops. Let me just pull this ribbon in. All right, so that's flat. Now I'm going to take another piece of ribbon, and I don't worry about these little broken ladders because that's going to be caught in the seam allowance. That's nothing to worry about at all. One other thing I wanted to mention is that you'll notice my ribbon tails are considerably longer than the ladders that I'm weaving through, and there's a good reason for that. It makes it easier to weave if you've got plenty of length to work with. But also, if I go to, when I go to stitch either side into another seam, I want to make sure that that stitching catches the end of the ribbons and it's secured in the seam. If I'm serging the seam on with an overlock stitch, the knife will trim those off. But if I decide that I want to stitch it on the sewing machine and press the seam allowance open, once it's all stitched, then I can just snip the excess length of the ribbons off. But it makes it easier to have that extra length for weaving as you're going along, but also it's for security so that those tails get caught in the seam line. Thanks for joining me today, and I hope you use the 2-thread flatlock or the 3-thread flatlock, whichever your machine does best, and try it out, send pictures, and use it on a project. I think you'll just love it. Thanks for watching. See you soon.